When did you all first come to Ashland?
Actually, can we backtrack just a second? Do you want our names for?
Sure.
You go first.
All right. I'm Betsy Hodges. This is my sister Martha, and our mother grew up here in Ashland. We grew up in Baltimore, but when Mom got married, she moved to Baltimore, and we came back to visit my grandmother. And we came from when I was born to 1963, when my grandmother passed away. And so we'll get into your questions, but I also want to backtrack a little bit because actually Mom is the one you really should be interviewing, except that she passed away at the beginning of the year. So I did bring some of her stuff. I'm going to try and work that into the conversation because that's really far more interesting than anything
she
more.
has a lot more memories because she lived here all of her
Yeah, she
growing
grew up
years.
here and lived here until she was 32 when she got married. So she had a much better track on what was going on in town and memories of that. Ours are all what we learned from her or just from visiting with my grandmother.
She always told us stories when we were little and of what it was, because we grew up in a big city and she grew up in a small town, so she would always pointed out the differences. And actually we came back fairly regularly after. Our grandmother died when we were almost 7 and almost 12, so my memories of visiting my grandmother aren't that good. But we came back to visit a lot because even though we didn't have any real close relatives, we still had lots of Mom's friends who were still here. So we've been coming back. We came back a lot through the rest of our childhood. There's probably a gap in maybe high school and college, and then Betsy moved back here after college, and then I moved back here. I moved to Richmond after college, so there'll be a gap in there, and even in our memories.
Okay. Can I go back to what you were saying about how your mom would tell you stories and your grandma would tell you stories about growing up in Ashland? Do you have like a favorite one that you remember that sticks out in your mind?
Well, there are lots of things that because Mom lived in the house which is now 807 South Center Street, and that is the house that her great-grandfather built in 1870, and his family lived in it, and then it came down through the family, and that's the house that Mom grew up in, that her parents moved into after my grandfather came back from World War I. The house right beside it, which is 805 South Center Street, my grandmother's parents built about 1890. Before my grandmother was born, but after her brother had been born. And so the two families lived beside each other, and the family activities kind of whirled around those two houses. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, when we would come back, we used to sit on, used to be a big porch, a big swing on the porch there at 807, and we would sit there and count the trains going by and the cars and wave to the guys and the guys in the caboose. And Mom when she was a little kid, they used to sit out there and count the hobos that were in the train and then yell it to the guy in the caboose. Of course, he couldn't hear it, but at any rate, that was something.
Well, because that was back during the Depression when people would hop trains to get places, and they'd just hop in the boxcars and try to get a free ride. But they'd be hanging out, and so Mom and all of her little friends would count them and then try to yell it to the guy in the caboose, but he never heard them.
At any rate.
Another true small town atmosphere. When Mom was a teenager, she and her friends were out. There was apparently one of the local gossip ladies lived like straight across the street, and Mom's very close friend. They were really good friends from when they were tiny little kids. And if they were out in the evening, with their friends, which basically meant going up to the drugstore up here. There used to be a drugstore right.
What Suzanne's is now, it used to be a
Barnes drugstore, and that was their local hangout, I think. Anyway, and this woman lived across the street from Mom, and then Mom's friend lived down the side street. And apparently this woman would watch and keep tabs on when they got home at night and report it to their mothers. And as if, I mean, this is back in the day when parents waited up for their kids anyway, but it just in case my grandmother missed something, or I guess our grandfather was alive then too. And, she would always, Mom used to tell us about the neighborhood gossip who kept tabs on when they got home every night.
One of the other things that she told us about, and I'm trying to find it in the, why don't you ask another question while I try and find it?
We have these stories that our mom used to write and give us. She was kind of our connection to the past. She was an only child, and so she would write all these stories for us and give them to us at Christmas.
Oh, that's really neat.
It is. That's the way we learned all kinds of things about. She actually would tell us some of the things they used to do. Oh, I do have a high school story from her. They used to roll in the old Ashland High School, which is now, well, I think it's been rebuilt several times over. It's now where Henry Clay Elementary, where Henry Clay Elementary is now used to be the old Ashland High School, and there was a way to roll marbles out of a classroom and bounce them off the walls and have them bounce down the steps, and that, which made this god-awful racket in, those old wooden buildings. And they used to do that. And a few other things.
Oh, well, the thing that she wrote about that I put in the, or submitted to the Ashland yearbook this year was that the hangout when she was in high school, and she graduated from Ashland High School in 1935, but there was a place called Bobby Stone's, which was out here on Route 1 below where Wachovia is, and that's where they used to go in if they had a date and either of them could get a car to drive over there. Then a quarter would buy 2 Cokes and a package of Nabs, which they split among themselves. And then whatever was left over was put into the Nickelodeon.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
The other story, this was a story kind of that Mom told on herself, but another small town atmosphere type thing. She and her mom had walked up Cross Brothers Grocery, which is still in existence, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, they had walked up the street to Cross Brothers, and Mom had pocketed something like a piece of penny candy or something, and I don't think she really intended to steal it. I think she figured it was one of those things that the guy would give her anyway. But when she got home, her mother realized what she'd done, and they had to walk back uptown and give it back. And I think it really, truly was a piece of penny candy or something. So she did occasionally tell stories on herself.
How do you think that, her childhood growing up in a small town differed from y'all's?
Oh, whoa.
Huge.
Yes, it's like 180 degrees.
Yeah, really.
Well, I'll tell you one thing she told me. Because we both grew up in Baltimore and went to Baltimore high schools, there were 3,000 in my high school, and that was more than the population of Ashland at that time. And I think she had a really hard time wrapping her head around those differences.
The fact that just to go to school, she went to school each day with the number of people in the entire town, just boggled Mom's mind. It was like, how can that even happen? And that, basically in Ashland, at that point, everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew everyone's business. And
yes, and she could go through town and tell you who lived in what house and when. I mean, all the houses up and down Center Street don't have an address, even though we refer to 805 and 807, the 2 houses that were in our family. It was always the Hoofknuckle house, which is the one across the street, and it was somebody else's house. It was that name. Whether that family lived in it or not, it was always known by a family name. And I guess just really the size of everything. Walking into a supermarket in Baltimore is way different, even in 1950 when she got married, from walking into Cross Brothers.
Yeah, just the sheer size of everything was. But I know she brought a lot of her small town things. I know whenever we got new neighbors, she'd always be the first one to make cookies and take them over. And we used to get some funny looks from people that, if they had just moved like from either other big cities or other parts of Baltimore, was like, people still do this. And this was back in the 60s, although nowadays occasionally people will do that, but still there were some small town things. She did, though, get used to the convenience of the big city.
Yeah.
And everything kind of right there, even though you had to fight the traffic. But
It was very different.
It was just everything was real different for her.
Yeah.
And it took her a while. Luckily, she had gone to Randolph-Macon Women's College. And when she moved to Baltimore, some people that she had known from college were living in Baltimore, so it wasn't like she was totally in a strange place. I mean, she was in a strange place, but there were people that she could start. She had instant friends, and then, of course, made friends as she got there. But I don't think my mother knew a stranger. But
what made her move to a big city, and do you think that she preferred a small town or a big city?
Well, she moved to Baltimore because she got married.
Yeah.
And my dad was living and working in Baltimore, and there was never any question.
Yeah.
And he was going to pick up and move to Ashland.
Yeah, no.
What was the second part of the question?
Which one do you think she preferred?
I think that there are aspects of both that she liked. I think she liked the smallness, the sense of community that you have in Ashland that you don't really have in a big city.
But she liked the conveniences of the big city, because when she first moved, she moved back here. Well, we moved my parents back here in September of '99. Our father had Alzheimer's, and we were both living in this area, and we have a brother who lives on the Outer Banks, and we were kind of calling the neighbors to check on mom and dad, and we really convinced them that really you needed to. If somebody was moving, it was going to be them. And she did sometimes make some comments about, and of course Ashland was different. There are still some of her friends around, but she did sometimes comment about the fact that she had gotten used to the conveniences of the big city. You didn't have to, it's a lot of times she would have to go into Richmond to get things, and that's 15 miles now, which is not a big deal, but when you're 80-some years old, that becomes a big deal. So,
Right.
So she did like the convenience of the big city, but she had made enough friends she had her church and other groups that she was with in Baltimore, so that it wasn't like she was overwhelmed with the gazillions of people.
I think in Baltimore, the neighborhood became like a little small town for her. The sense of community that you have here in Ashland is a small town. It gets recreated in neighborhoods in bigger cities, and that's how she.
And we always lived in a neighborhood that was pretty family oriented.
Mm-hmm.
We basically lived in the same neighborhood for most of our growing up years. We moved once 6 blocks away because we needed a bigger house, but we stayed in the same neighborhood. So that she did. We didn't even have to switch schools or anything. It was, but I do remember she did comment a couple times after she got back here that it was easier to find stuff in the big city, but she still liked being back here.
Did you have any other siblings?
Yeah, we have a brother
brother
between us.
Yeah, and he used to come down in the summers,
I think
early 6, 7, and 8 maybe.
I was going to say 7, 8, and 9, but I'm not sure the ages we're talking about.
Yeah.
To go to a day camp.
Day camp here.
Camp Apache.
Camp Apache that was run actually here on the college campus. It was run by the athletic director, I think, or the football coach of the anyway, it was this day
I was
camp.
thinking it was the basketball coach.
Yeah.
It wasn't a basketball camp, it was just an all-around.
It was just a day camp, it was almost like a YMCA camp, only there wasn't a YMCA out here at that point. Because we had some family friends who had 5 kids who were a little closer in age than the 3 of us were, but that meant we all had friends to play with. and he would come down and stay with our grandmother and go to camp with the child out of that. There was one of the 3 boys in that family was his age, and they would go to camp together every summer, and that was a big thing.
Which,
So-
according to Mother, worked out great because it meant that Randy was at camp with his friends all day. By the time he got home and my grandmother had to do anything for him, Randy was too tired and needed a bath.
Right.
So all she had to really do was make sure he got cleaned up and was fed. But I'll tell you one thing that it's interesting that I remember from coming to visit my grandmother. We did not have a TV. I know this seems really weird, but we did not have a TV until my grandmother died in '63, and then we got all of hers. But my parents never bought one. So up until then, whenever we would come down to visit my grandmother, it was really a big deal to sit and watch TV.
Yeah, and she had this little room off of her dining room that was a TV room. And we would, after dinner, we could go watch TV, which was a huge treat because we didn't get to do that.
Right, and we could sometimes eat lunch and watch TV.
Yes, and our grandmother was really strict, and the fact that she would let us do that is just boggles the mind. But yeah, that's true. I'd forgotten that. And the other thing we used to do, and this just sounds weird now, I know, but we would, if we could hear a train coming, we'd get some pennies and put them out on the tracks, and then after the train went by, we would go get the flattened copper.
People still do that.
Oh.
Like, my friend actually just did that a couple
Okay.
days ago.
All right.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I remember. The other thing that I remember, because I look exactly like my mother and my grandmother. I mean, I don't ever remember not being told how much I look like those two. And I would come down here. Sometimes I would be brought down to visit my grandmother and just left. And my grandmother would sort of parade me around. And no one could remember my name, so they just called me Little. My mother's first name was Virginia, so they just called me Little Virginia. It was like, no, my name is Martha. That was one thing, and I swear I was barely walking when people did that to me, and I'm sure I probably wasn't even out of the hospital yet when people told me how much I looked like my mother, because you can take our baby pictures, and switch them, and unless you can look at the rest of the picture and know that they're not who's who, you don't know.
Yeah, interestingly enough, at the scholarship dinner the other night, a couple of older Ashland folks came up to Martha and said how much she looked like Mom. So.
Oh yes, I literally I've heard that all my life, and so my grandmother just thought, because that meant I also looked a fair amount like my grandmother, because they looked a fair amount alike. So my grandmother loved parading me around to show me off, just because I looked like the family.
So when you were younger and you would come visit your grandparents, what are some other things that you would do for fun?
We had a little pool. We had a little wading pool in the backyard that we played on. Played on the swing. She had a big swing set in the backyard that we played on. I think that was even better than the one we had in our own yard, maybe.
I remember the swing set in the backyard, and I remember there was a porch swing in the front that we used to sit on. But I don't remember. I remember going to the post office, which is not the current post office, but the old post office where I don't know what, it's the building across the side by side, but across that street. Mm-hmm. But I don't remember. I don't remember, doing specific stuff or coming down.
Because we didn't have any first cousins.
Right.
My mom was an only child. And I remember just we sometimes would have to go visit people.
But I just remember coming down and, playing in the backyard or.
Yeah, we usually did. Playing in the backyard, because we did have the little wading pool. We have some interesting pictures of us in that. The family that moved, our family sold the 805 house, and that house actually was an upstairs and a downstairs apartment, and there was a family in there that had a little girl about my age, so I had sort of a playmate. And then after our grandfather died before any of us were born, so we never got to meet him, but after our grandmother died, we frequently came down and stayed. This family with the 5 children lived out on a farm out right across from Patrick Henry High School. We stayed out there a lot, and we did a lot of stuff on the farm with them. or went swimming at Hanover Country Club with somebody. Somebody would get us in there, and we'd go swimming out there, because I know I've been out there, but I was out there a bunch of times as a little kid. I don't. Sometimes. Well, did Grandma ever take us like sightseeing places around here?
I'm sure that we did go visit stuff.
Our grandmother was real big into history, and I think she probably took us to
Places in Richmond.
But
I don't remember that as a as a big standout memory. Mostly it's just we would come down in the summertime. Except Randy that came for day camp more often than not. And we came, Mom would bring us down for a visit.
Yeah, but it was usually only a couple of days.
And then, then we'd go back. It was, 95 was not built, but traveling up and down 301 was probably just as quick as 95 is now.
Yeah.
And so we would come down regularly, but not for long chunks of time.
Right. And actually, because our grandmother would usually come up to us for Christmas.
Yes. She drove. As opposed to our grandmother Hodges, who lived in Baltimore, who did not drive. Our grandmother Sidner here had a car, drove everywhere. She took lots of trips. She always came to Baltimore for Christmas. And when we would come here, she would, if we went places, she would take us.
I don't remember. Yeah,
I just remember swinging on the porch.
Yeah, the big porch swing was a big thing. That was.
I'm sure he did, and watching television. I mean, I know that sounds really weird, but that was really a big treat.
Yes,
that was really a big treat when you're 8, 9, 10.
Yeah. Well, and when she died in the summer, and I remember my parents were down here a lot cleaning out the house. Actually, I was young enough when she died that my biggest memories were cleaning. We're coming down here and clean out the house, and we just had to occupy ourselves while Mom and Dad did that. And our father was the one that was the no TV fan, and my great uncle, my grandmother's brother, had gotten a TV. If you wanted a TV in your hospital room, you had to provide it yourself, and he had bought her one for her hospital room because she was in there for a while. And then she had this big,
console,
off the floor. You've probably never even seen one like this. And so Dad had to figure out how to get rid of these 2 TVs, and he couldn't figure out any way to get rid of them, so he finally had to bring them home, and it was the last trip home that he brought those up. And I do remember that I was only going to be in the 2nd grade the next morning. He said, "Yes, we have TVs, but there will be no TV on school nights, and if you get caught, you will not watch TV for 2 weeks." And my dumb brother and I got caught one day. I don't remember how old I was, but I couldn't have been any more than 3rd grade, because it was in the house that we lived in until the summer after my 3rd grade year. And Mom had gone out to run an errand and she wasn't gone so long that she left us alone, and we didn't hear the car pull up, and she walked in the door and caught us red-handed. And sure enough, we didn't watch TV for 2 weeks. But so watching TV, well, that was a big deal for us. Our friends were like, even then our friends were like, "What do you mean you don't have a TV?" So, and the Amos and Andy show was one of the big things, and some weird things, but
I Love Lucy was.
Oh yeah, and I Love Lucy. That was definitely I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver. But I Love Lucy was a biggie. Yeah.
Did you or your parents or your grandparents ever take the train a lot, or not? Really?
Yes, actually, they did. That's the way my parents courted for the 9 months.
Yeah.
That between when they met, and this story is probably more interesting than anything. During World War II, when the soldiers were stationed down at, it's now Fort Lee, but it was Camp Lee then, down Petersburg. They were encouraging families up and down, I guess, the railroad line to take some of the soldiers in for special events. And so Mom actually she was living at home with her parents, and this was in 1940, 41, in there.
42, 40, yeah, well, 41 was Pearl Harbor, and actually there were people, I know somebody was at her house
Yeah,
the-
that's another interesting
the
story.
day of
Oh.
Pearl Harbor, because they went to the movies to hide, so he wouldn't have to
Yeah,
come
that
call
story
back.
is here, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But at any rate, one of the soldiers that they had for Christmas dinner,
Yeah, they had 3 soldiers one year for Christmas dinner, that's right.
and
He was in OC,
Oh, it was-
he was
yeah.
in officer school.
that was in Christmas of '42. They had 3 soldiers come up. One of them was from Bel Air, Maryland, which is outside Baltimore, and his name was Jack Record, and Mom and her parents had struck up a really nice friendship with him, and so he had his sister and his mother come down and stay with Mom and her parents at various times for special occasions, and then Mom and Jack's sister Betty Record went traveling quite a bit through the 40s until Betty got married in Baltimore, and then Betty had a cousin, Ann O'Connell, and Mom got to know Ann through Betty Record, and the 3 of them actually did a lot of traveling together also. And then actually when Ann got married, Mom went up for the wedding, and
Ann set her up with our dad, because
Yeah.
Ann's cousin on the other side is our father.
And
So
that's
it's kind of a funny way there, but
right, and so that was in November of
49,
1949, and so from then until
September of 1950.
1950, then the way they traveled back and forth was, the way they
We
met
did
up on
together.
the weekends was by train. And so Dad would hop on the train in Baltimore and come down here, or Mom would take the train up to Baltimore. And interestingly enough, before they moved down here, but one of them was already here staying with me at the time, and Dad came down on the train, and we picked him up at the train station, and the first thing he said was, "Whoa, we haven't had this kind of meeting in a long time." But so, yes, they use the train quite a bit.
And then our great grandfather was the conductor on the little commuter train that went from Ashland to Richmond and Richmond to Ashland.
The accommodation
They
train.
called it the accommodation train, because basically it was people who, they went down in the morning and they took, people to work, or ladies who were going shopping or whatever, and then they brought them back in the afternoon.
Right, they made, the accommodation train left Ashland in the morning, went into Richmond, then came back, and then kind of where your brick walkway, your brick sign out there in the corner, it wasn't that, it was a little side track, and they pulled the train off into there, and then in the afternoon, it made us another trip and went into Richmond and picked everybody up and brought them back home.
Yeah.
And this is another thing I did for the yearbook. He did that, he was the conductor on the accommodation train for so long that it just became known. as-
His name was Blakey, so they called it Captain Blakey's train.
Right, his name was Charlie Blakey. And he actually started as the conductor on the particular accommodation train on March 21st of 1885, and he retired on January 25th, 1925.
So that's 40 years.
Yeah, so for 40 years, he was the conductor. He was about to turn, oh, well, shoot, I've forgotten. Never mind. I think I want to say he was 70. That'd be right. Yeah, I think that's right, 70. Yes, he was 70. So he was, actually, the train was a big part of the family going back several generations. The Mom's great-grandparents, the one that, Rice was their last name, and they had been, Samuel Rice had been building working on bridge repairs in the Richmond area at the close of the Civil War, and stayed on and took a job with RF&P. And actually, pretty much right down through the family, the RF&P is a big part of how they worked. Samuel Rice and several of his sons worked for the RF&P. And then on the Blakey side, although my great-grandfather grew up in Richmond, he went to work almost immediately for the RF&P and then came out as the conductor on the accommodation train and did that for 40 years.
Yeah, so the railroad was, actually, without a railroad, there probably wouldn't be Ashland.
Interesting, given in light of the discussion that's going on now about Amtrak cutting service.
Oh, yeah, and like completely cutting out any stops in Ashland or something.
Yeah, but the railroad is a big part. The railroad has provided jobs for family members and also generally.
We've used it.
Yes, it is how mom and dad courted. That sounds like a real dated. I don't know. I think they courted in 1949.
If our grandmother had anything to do with it, they were courting. She was pretty straight laced.
I have taken the train home to Baltimore once since I've been here.
I've taken it down. I've used it a couple times. When I know one year I was in graduate school and my car was in Colorado and mom and dad were in Baltimore and you were here. So, and actually I was living here, but I'd sublet my apartment in Richmond. So I came back and I came down on the train. So yeah, I've used it a few times.
Can we go back to when you were talking about World War II and Pearl Harbor?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that was the other thing. There was the one story that we sort of alluded to. I know they often would invite the soldiers out just for Sunday, go to church and then have dinner. This was back when they ate dinner right after church. And I know my mother had I think she sort of had a date with some guy on, I guess it would have been December. It would have been the day after Pearl Harbor hit. By the time the news got back here or something. And so, the guy says, let's go to the movies because they can't find me in the movies because he knew he was going to get called up to active duty. So he got to delay his being called up for like 2 hours while they went to a movie. Oh, she's got the full story, but that's in there somewhere.
Well, she says here Aunt Lil was staying with us at the time, and Aunt Lil would have been her grandmother's sister. She says Aunt Lil was staying with us at the time, and she was the first one to hear the news. She had gone up to her room after dinner and was listening to the radio when the program was interrupted with a horrifying announcement that Pearl Harbor had been attacked by the Japanese. She came downstairs immediately, and we all sat there listening in stunned silence. After a while, Willie, and earlier in this, she says that's her friend from Winchester who was stationed at Camp Lee that she dating. I use that term.
Yeah, he was a friend of a college friend of hers or something. Yeah, and
At any rate, after a while, Willie and I went uptown to Barnes Drugstore and found Sarah Jones, who's Sarah right now, and I'm sure somebody's interviewing her. Found Sarah Jones and Arthur Tuttle. Sarah and Tut had been married in October, and he was in the Army Air Corps stationed at Langley Field and was home for the weekend. He and Willie were both out of uniform, and they looked at each other as the radio blared the announcement, "All servicemen report to your unit immediately." Sarah and Tut left to go home. Willie said, "Let's go to the movies." Then I won't know I should be reporting then. We went to the Bird Theater in Richmond. Afterwards, we had something to eat. He took me back to Ashland and returned to camp. I didn't hear from him for several weeks. When he checked in, learned that his unit had been assigned to guard a bridge in Petersburg, and by early the next morning they had set up a temporary camp at the site. Later he told me he didn't change his clothes for 2 weeks. With President Roosevelt's announcement the next day, the whole world seemed turned upside down. Okay, and that's all that she said about Pearl Harbor.
And did you say that your grandfather fought in the war?
He was in
World
World War
War
One.
Okay.
He volunteered to be in an ambulance company. He did not want to carry a gun.
Or walk to his dinner or something.
Walk to his meals. Those are his two requirements. But he felt that, he knew
Yeah, so he drove an ambulance.
he volunteered. He was actually 30 at the time. In July 1917, he went and volunteered for the service in the ambulance company. He had actually planned to marry my grandmother then, but they put those wedding plans on hold, and he reported to Camp Lee, and then he traded with the other people in his company for Christmas leave, and the first one that he actually drew was for May of 1918, but he felt sure that they would already have been shipped to France by then. So he kept trading with his buddies till he finally got, and I think he traded 3 or 4 times, the way Mom tells the story,
Yeah.
until he got a January leave date. And so he came home in January of 1919, and he and my grandmother... 1918, and he and my grandmother got married. Actually in 805, and because Captain Blakey who was now his father-in-law, was such a big wig or such a big influence in the train that he actually got the train bound for Washington to stop and pick up my grandparents to go to Washington for their honeymoon, right in front of them.
Like 2 days long, yeah.
Right, and then they came back, and then, actually, my grandmother took an apartment or a small room down in Petersburg while my grandfather was stationed at Camp Lee. But then he was actually sent to France.
Yeah, he was, because he was actually in France when our mother was born. Our mother was born in November of 1918, like 4 days after Armistice Day. But he was in France then, and he didn't get home to see her, because, then they had to send him home on ships, and he's another 6 months getting home. He didn't get home until
But when he left in May of 1918, then my grandmother, actually she went down to Norfolk to see him off, and then came back to Ashland, and for the year that he was overseas.
Yeah.
But once Martha was correct, once armistice was signed, then they had to ship all these guys home, but it was by ship, it wasn't by an airplane, and it took him 6 months before his group or company
got sent home. Because he apparently had, like I said, we never got to meet him, but he apparently had a really good singing voice, and he was in some entertainment crew.
They made a quartet out of 4 of the guys, and they shipped them around kind of like the USO.
Yeah,
they
entertain all these soldiers waiting to come home.
Right, and so that's what he did until his name came up.
Until he finally got to come home, yeah. So he got home about April or May or something.
He came home in May of 1919, and then he came back
to Ashland, and he was a fertilizer salesman.
He went traveling around the state
He
before southern states in the co-ops.
Yeah. He literally, but he was mostly day travels. I mean, I don't think he was gone overnight much. He was mostly
Oh, I think he was.
Oh, well, anyway.
Yeah. Well, he did a lot of day trips, but he had covered a good chunk of the state.
Back then, you could get a driver's license at 14, but you couldn't drive. I know, imagine that now. You couldn't drive in the big cities, so our mother had her driver's license when she was 14, and so she would drive him around.
One summer he
had her just drive him around.
He had an operation on his foot and couldn't drive.
So she drove him around, and he bought her lunch.
Bought her lunch. That was her pay.
Her pay was lunch and a Coke in the morning and a Coke in the afternoon. That's why I didn't think I thought those were all day trips, though.
That could be, but I also know that he covered Lynchburg down that way. So I have a feeling that some of those were overnight stays. He had a huge territory for when he first started out in the early 1900s. It was Old Buck guano. It was bought out and became Richmond guano.
Yeah.
But anyway, he did sell fertilizer to the farmers.
Earlier you were talking about how they would house the soldiers for like Christmas or
Yeah.
on Sundays. Was church like like a big part of your family life?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Especially in a small town.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was, even though Duncan Memorial has the name Duncan Memorial, it was the Methodist Church. And then there's the Baptist Church, which it's First Ashland Baptist Church, First
Right,
Baptist.
but the
Ashland
Baptist church when they were growing up was the Arts and Activities Center now. My grandfather went to that church, and he was choir director for about 25 years.
Yeah.
Her Rice great-grandparents had actually sort of been in the organizing stages of Duncan Memorial, and which is what they call the old chapel. It's your what do they call that building over there?
Are you talking about the old chapel?
The old chapel.
They just
Yes,
call it the old chapel.
Okay,
Yeah,
the
I
old
was gonna say, I think
chapel,
it's still
okay.
just the old
All
chapel.
right, well, Samuel Rice was a part of the group that was organizing and building that.
Right, because they were going to have the one floor was the church and one floor was the college chapel, and they were trying to decide which to put where. And he kept saying, well, the college students are younger, they can walk up the steps, and the church should be on the first floor. And plus he said, and this ends up being kind of funny, he said, and plus the fact that when the old folks start dying, you're not going to want to be carrying the caskets down the steps. But he didn't convince anybody. They ended up putting originally the church was on the second floor and the chapel was the bottom floor. The college chapel was the bottom floor, and he was the first person to die. His was the first casket they had to lug down the steps. But then I don't know when they built the actual Duncan Memorial Church now.
Oh, I'm sure it's either 52 or 53. It's been since Mom and Dad were
Yeah, because our parents were married in
the
the upstairs of the old chapel.
chapel.
Yeah. But yeah, there was, it was the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church and the Episcopal. If you lived in Ashland, you went to one. And not that anybody cared, but yeah, Sunday morning everybody went to church. Whether you went whichever, in the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church. But yeah, church was a big thing.
It's interesting because even though I know that they had an influence in the beginning of the church, and that Mom and grandmother and my grandfather with the Baptist church, it was an important part of her life of all the things that she wrote down. There's no, she didn't write.
She didn't make a lot of mention of.
And actually, what I have found out is by reading this Aunt Lil that I referenced in the Pearl Harbor story, who was my grandmother's aunt. She wrote a little bit about it. Apparently, Mom's grandmother was very active in the stuff that went on at Duncan, but I think Mother probably just came because it was expected of her. I'm not sure that she did.
And I don't think they had like the youth, like, I don't know if you all are active in your church youth groups, but like kids talk about youth group and stuff like that. I don't think that there was that kind of, you just went to Sunday school and you went to church in the morning, then you went home and did your stuff for the rest of the week and went back the next Sunday. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like where kids are real active in their church youth groups these days. So I don't think it was that kind of activity. I mean, I don't know that they ever talked about stuff like that. I mean, even when we were growing up and we're kind of in between, youth group was somewhat of a bigger thing. It was a bigger thing for us than it would have been for our mother.
How do you think that like having a college pretty much in the center of the town affects, I guess, the people that live here?
Well, it made a big difference in Mom's life. For one thing, it sounds really funny, but at 14, 15, she dated college kids.
Yeah.
It was perfectly, I mean, and again, we're talking early 30s.
Yeah.
It was perfectly acceptable and not a problem. And I don't know, she dated college kids for a long time.
Yeah. A lot of things that she would talk about, are kind of centered around the town the town and the college were connected. Yeah. There was a lot of
her, she talked a lot about Dr. Lipscomb, and I don't know whether he taught here, whether his family was involved here, but there was some connection. And he was her Latin professor at Randolph-Macon Women's College, but I think he had actually...
He had connections here somehow or other.
So there was a pretty good tie between her family and the college,
Right.
and actually Samuel Rice, who brought his family here in 1871, came. He had one son that was already grown and actually working with the RF&P, and then he had my great-grandmother, who at that time was I'll say a young woman of 20, and then he had 3 boys, all of whom he was figuring to educate, and that's why he brought his family here, because the college was here, and actually all of them, they didn't all stay, but they all took classes, at least one graduated.
Yeah.
And then my grandmother's brother
Yeah, our great uncle went here.
graduated from here. So the college is very much intertwined in our family.
And back, I think when Mom was growing up, a lot of the professors that lived here in the town.
Probably more so now.
Yeah, don't probably think fewer of them live here now than back then, but back then I would probably say the huge majority of them lived here in the town.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the college was a big part of the town.
So after growing up in Baltimore, what made you want to come back here?
Well, I was transferred into a job in Richmond in the mid-'70s, and actually I was working for a very small company in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they sent me up here to their Richmond office, and the housing arrangements that had been made for me were not going to work out, and that's a whole another separate story. It wasn't because they did anything wrong, it's just that at this end there were some problems, so I called up.
I thought you showed up.
No, I
We do have so we didn't have any first cousins, but we had more distant cousins. But since it's such a small town, we had known them all of our lives. So we
Actually, the man that I worked for in Charlotte had told me that I could stay with his daughter, but when I got up here, it turned out his daughter's boyfriend was here from New York, and the boss in Charlotte absolutely hated the guy, and so they couldn't tell him that I couldn't really stay there. So I called up Blanton Cousins. Again, I'm sure that somebody will be interviewing Blantons, but Pat and Mutt and my mom are second cousins on the Rice side, and so I called up Pat and Mutt and I said, I'm here in Richmond and I need a place to stay. So I came out to their farm and stayed with them for a week until the boyfriend left. And then I lived in Richmond for 12 years, and then actually when Pat and Mutt's son was getting ready to build on the farm, and he and his wife were living in a house outside of town, and I said, I'm really interested in buying it. When you get ready to sell it, call me. So they did, and I've lived out here since 1987.
Yeah, she was living in Richmond, paying Richmond taxes for no services, so she was ready to get out.
No, I moved out here because I wanted a rural environment.
I've actually never lived out here, but when I graduated from college, I graduated in the middle of my senior year, and my first teaching job was in this little town in South Carolina, and I got the job in the middle of the year, and I was miserable. I hated it, so I had put in a bunch of job applications all around Virginia. I really didn't want to go back to Baltimore. I liked it, but it was too big, and I really had no interest in going back. And I had visited around here enough that I was looking anywhere around here would have been nice, but I had applications all over Virginia. Mm-hmm. And because I had gone to college out in Indiana, so I was ready to get back on the East Coast. And so after that one semester in South Carolina, I kept following up on all these places where I had interviews, and I actually got a job in Richmond. So I came here then, and that'll be 30 years in August. I taught in Richmond for 5 years, and then I've been in Henrico. I teach in Henrico now, and I've been there ever since. So I've never actually lived in Ashland, but back and forth when I had my parents and my sister here, I was out here a lot now. Just out here on occasion. Well, we're still cleaning out our mother's house, but so.
I guess for one last question, what's your favorite thing about Ashland?
I think my favorite thing as a kid would be going to sleep with the sound of the freight train going down, because with the house being right on Center Street, I mean, actually, I'm 2.5 miles outside of town, and on a really quiet night, I can hear the trains. But when you live right by the track, and even though you tune them out, it was really nice to go to sleep at night to the sound of the freight train running down. That was,
Yeah.
and probably swinging on the porch.
Yeah, I would say
Swinging.
sitting on that big front porch swing, waving at the trains and stuff. Yeah, our father said, he used to say that the first time he came down to visit, and he went to bed the very first night, and the train came through. He thought it was coming down the middle of his bed. But yeah, I would say swinging on the old house with the big porch on the porch swing. That was probably my favorite thing.
Well, thank you for letting us interview you.
Sure.